I am so conservative.
Rationalize in my head. These are things I read in
And
the
I'm going to talk about Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had invited...
I remembered at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah. I am so conservative. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative. And welcome to the Unknown Webcast. Today is January 11, 2022, and this is broadcast number 273. This is a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones, which there are increasing amounts of people believing that. I really am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving. In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection. Today, John Collins joins us again this week to talk about militant Christian extremism, John Alexander Dowie. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm trees came out, saw their shadows, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is My Bible, guaranteed. Is that flashing the way I see it there, Don? Is it flashing?
I see it flashing. I didn't know you were a flasher, Ron.
I'm going to stop sharing. I don't want to trigger anybody's...
Whatever, yeah.
Yeah, let's try it again. Let's see if it happens this time. No, it didn't. I have no idea why it happened the last time. If you were an epileptic and you went into a seizure, I apologize. Guarantee the most comfortable Bible you'll ever own, the My Bible. Our regular legal disclaimer, our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be John Collins, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter known as the webcast, although we probably will not mention it again. This satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Notice the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you enjoy this webcast or it really annoys you and you want to inflict it on someone else to ensure your continued access, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click on the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. This webcast is Y2K compliant, and don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. Greetings, John Collins from the William Branham Historical Research. What is it, a foundation, or that's just the whole name right there?
That's just the name right there.
Foundation, corporation, New World Order, whatever it is.
Whatever. By the way, we should mention, for those who are unaware of what Y2K compliant means, because that was 12 years ago.
No, 22 years ago.
Yeah.
22 years ago. Time flies.
You're only a decade behind.
Fun or not, yeah. I mean, there was this terrible fear that all the computers would just short out on us. We couldn't make coffee with our electric coffee maker any longer. Hair blowers would stop. Life would just end. I was just
going to let it go unexplained and let them wonder and write in and tell them if they make a big contribution, we would explain it to them.
Well, I run IT companies and I had to deal with it directly, and it was a big deal.
Yeah, I know, but I did research. In fact, we did an article just prior to that called Y2K, Genuine Crisis or Overhyped Circus. We lost 50% of our support because people said, "You don't believe the Bible," as somehow Y2K is in the Bible.
Yeah.
I don't really.
So
I had to deal
really,
with that too. Interestingly, in the technology company,
we lost
we had
50%, Don. We really did.
Yeah,
we had
really
one
did,
client that actually created an underground bunker, and his entire basement was lined with canned food. And he purchased these great big old nasty mean dogs. And we would walk into his house to do the work, and he would smack the dogs to keep them angry. I said, "What are you doing that for?" And he says, "Y2K is coming. I have to be prepared."
I had to be prepared.
So-
Yeah, well, it was crazy.
Now, John, would you say it was a big deal, or people made a big deal out of it?
It was absolutely a big deal. The problem in plain English is that the buffer to hold the year, programmers were lazy. And instead of a 4-digit year, they were doing 98, 99. Well, the problem is once it rolls over to 01, all of your math fails.
Or 00.
So all of your accounting goes off, all of your subscriptions, everything that recurs now falls back to 01 instead of 2001, or 2000.
Right. Well, at least that was the assumption, and that was in dispute even at the time. So it was interesting.
Yeah.
And as the clock tipped over, I started getting emails from friends in New Zealand saying lights are still on here, and I kept as it progressed through the planet, I kept getting emails going, well, we're okay here. So anyway.
By that time, though, the computer programmers have been working on it for a few years, right?
Yeah, there were some companies that still had issues. The problem is you can't identify every single buffer. So there were companies that just scrapped their entire software platforms and created a new software platform.
Oh, okay.
But there were some companies that actually failed.
Yeah.
Really? So
that isn't what we're talking about. I just thought it was an interesting sidetrack because we keep talking about being Y2K compliant. We are talking about John Alexander Dowie today, who is not the originator of Pentecostalism as we know it today, but was a key figure in kind of modern day Pentecostalism, and somebody who was impacted by him through others was William Branham. And you said you have something that you would like to share today that's going to be a first. You heard it here first.
Oh yeah, it's first on this show. Yeah, are you able to show the slides?
Right there.
So if you study William Branham or the New Apostolic Faith Movement or God's Generals, any of these people claiming to be credible talking about William Branham, they use this photograph. This is William Branham.
Wow.
It was taken in the Houston Coliseum, and even though the lighting in the Coliseum was exactly like what you see in that photograph, Branham claimed that this was the pillar of fire and that you can faintly see the man's head behind William Branham's head. He claimed that everyone in this building witnessed this cloud of fire. Well, if you see this photograph and see the man's head, he's not even looking at it. Like there's nothing going on. So the Branham propaganda machine has doctored the photos to black out all the other heads so you can't see that they're not seeing it. And according to Branham's cult theology, this photograph was rushed by the head of the FBI to be documented as the only supernatural photograph ever taken, and claimed that it hung in the Hall of Religious Art in Washington, D.C.
Oh.
Well, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, I have the documentation that proves that this his entire story was a hoax. The guy that he claimed was the head of the FBI never worked for the FBI. And really...
What year was this?
This was in I have to look it up. I think it was 1952 or so.
That was in J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah. So, it's a crazy thing. If you'll fast forward towards the end of the slides, there is another cult relic. I guess I can transition to that. There's several. I don't know if you caught it. There is a slide where these people are actually worshiping Branham's photograph inside of a church, and this photograph is just dominating the world religious platform of Branhamism. So debunking this is actually a huge deal. This is a tour bus where they're saying that, you know, this is God. This is, you can see even written on the back of the bus, this is God. He claimed that it was Jesus Christ in this light above his head, which was, you know, some sort of a halogen.
Here's the funny thing. I gave a presentation on Dowie, John Alexander Dowie, a few weeks ago, and I included a photo, that very photo of William Branham, and it has that streak over his head, and nothing in the source indicated that this was supposed to be a halo or anything.
So
I just copied and pasted, and I didn't make any remark about this white streak over his head. I had no idea what it was. But you're telling me that they were, or Branham himself was promoting that as this pillar of fire?
Yeah, Branham claimed that it was the only supernatural photograph ever taken. He varies in his descriptions. In some cases, he says it's Jesus or an angel. Some cases, he says it's the pillar of fire. But the bottom line is, it was rushed to Washington, D.C., but the photographers who captured the photograph, they rushed it to copyright it so they could get money out of it. So it did go to Washington, D.C. There was no religious hall of art, so the whole story was a hoax. And interestingly, the two photographers, one of them, their son was on death row. Their nephew was on death row for having a sexual orgy in Houston, Texas, during which time they killed a man. The guy was the nephew was he and his girlfriend were prostitutes. He was a transvestite. While Branham was with, Branham tried to stay the execution. So while Branham is in Houston trying to stay the execution, this cloud that's on the screen, I'm hoping it's on the screen where you can see it. This cloud, this strange, unusual cloud, floated across Arizona. So while he's there, this cloud event happened. And then after he returned to Arizona to hunt, then back to his hometown in Jeffersonville, somebody handed him a copy of Life magazine with this cloud image, just the single image. And he says, "Oh, I was there. I was standing underneath this. That's not a cloud. That's 7 angels." So this is another cult relic that is, it's prevalent in all of the Branham churches. My family actually had this photograph and the halo photograph on our wall in our living room. I mean, that's how big this thing was. So here is the unclassified document number 2 from the United States Air Force, describing the Thor missile detonation that caused this cloud. And in their words, this was the result of a military operation, not divine intervention. I'll go to the next slide. Fast forward to, some of them have been doctored. Manipulative cult leaders take 2 images and they transpose the face of Jesus in this cloud. And there are a large number of people who contact me on my website asking about this because they think this is a real image. They think that Jesus's head literally looked down on the state of Arizona in the midst of this cloud formation. So very, very big news to have this declassified.
So you're saying that's not legit? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, this picture is not legit. The cloud itself is legit.
I'm teasing. I would never have thought it was legit. But there are people who do think. I mean, I don't want to laugh at people, but
yeah, it's really sad.
Yeah, it's it's kind of like that poster. I don't know if you ever watched the X-Files back in the 90s. Fox Mulder had this poster in his basement office with a flying saucer, and the caption is, "I want to believe," And there is something in all of us that, I mean, we want to believe there's something more, there's something beyond us, but unfortunately we're willing to grasp at anything other than God's word.
Right.
That's the problem.
And as an interesting transition point, if you read the book on Dowie, This is literally the notion that empowered him. People wanted to believe that what he said was true. And he was nothing more than a confidence man. He just continually said it was true until they believed it.
Yeah. And he probably sounded very confident, very sure of himself. And he was also, wasn't he from Scotland?
He was from Scotland. And then he transitioned to Australia, where he started his ministry by stealing a church.
Yeah. How else did
how did he didn't like just pack it up in a suitcase and take it somewhere else, right? He did something else.
No, I'll be honest, it's the first recorded instance of, through the newspapers, recorded instance of mind control that I've identified. There was a pastor in, can't remember the town, it was near Melbourne, but he had taken ill and he went on a sabbatical. And Dowie was growing somewhat famous for his position against the Catholic Church and against spiritualism. So he formed a bond with his pastor, and the pastor said, "I'm sick, I'm going on a sabbatical, can you watch my church?" And he did. Well, during the course of his time as pastor, he basically brainwashed the church members to become militant, and they were going door to door, pounding on the doors and saying, "You so-and-so are a sinner, come out and be scolded," or whatever. So,
scolded.
He used different words, I'm sure, but that was in effect what happened.
Yeah. So what techniques, when you say it's the first example of mind control that you've been able to document, or the earliest, what particular techniques did you find him using?
You mentioned the X-Files, and I have seen the X-Files. I've actually watched all of them.
Yeah.
At the time I watched it, I didn't know any of this. I knew some of the history of Branham, but I didn't know any of this that I've identified, or the mind control elements. And if you had have asked me, leading up to my escape from the Branhamism, or even shortly after, and you mentioned the word mind control, I would have thought, actually, this is science fiction. I would have thought this doesn't exist. But I actually had to go on a rescue mission with a person who is a mind control expert, during which time I was given a crash course in mind control. And after Hitler did what he did in Germany, the United States government tried to weaponize it. So there were actually studies going on where they were learning how to control people's minds. And the studies that I watched were just fascinating. They were showing classrooms where they were showing slides that had, 4 different links of a bar. And you could obviously see that the third one was incredibly short. And they actually convinced a man to believe that the shortest one was the longest one in a matter of like 15 minutes, just numerous examples that they were showing me. So I've been going through that. Once I understood how it worked and why, I've been then applying it to the different cults that I've identified that are dominating the United States. Through that, I learned that Jim Jones was in Branham's message cult.
Right.
And in the course of that study, that's actually what led me to Dowie. I had learned that Dowie was actually Branham's prototype. And the prototype.
Yeah, okay. He followed him as his prototype. Yeah.
Right. Branham had, there's a man touring with Branham named F.F. Bosworth, who was a high-ranking member of Dowie's commune.
Right.
After Dowie died, Bosworth basically tried to recreate Dowie's healing revival machine, and he sort of faltered once a person who, quote unquote, was healed died a few days later. So then he started going with Branham. He was actually with Branham at the event that had the halo. The halo photo was captured. One of Branham's campaign managers named Gordon Lindsay was also raised under the doctrines of Dowie. So heavy Dowie influence in Branham's ministry.
Well, in your book on Jones, you start off with a couple of other cults that sort of preceded Dowie, communal cults.
Right.
So he's not the first communal cult leader, really, but he's had a profound impact on Pentecostalism in its current state, let's say.
Right. I did not realize until I started putting words to this book. I'll take a brief moment and tell you how the book formed. In the course of my research, I've been collecting timelines and collecting data. There are over 50,000 newspaper articles available on John Alexander Dowie,
Right.
and there's no really good search tool that can search that text. So I literally read 50,000 articles to come up with this book.
Whoa.
And then put them all in chronological order and started adding paragraphs to it. It isn't until you put it in order chronologically that you really grasp how deep this runs. But Dowie was basically ran out of Australia. He tried to recreate what he had in Australia in the UK, in London. Londoners were like, no, you're not doing this to us. Get out of here. He comes to San Francisco, and San Francisco newspapers were just naive. They were like, okay, this man says it must be real. And so he was basically going and having these revivals and saying, back in London, I healed so-and-so, and back in Australia, I healed so-and-so. And he has this stack of papers that he uses as his own reference material. And they begin publishing this stuff. So now the communities think it's real. They don't know that the investigators haven't really done their due diligence. And he grows such a stronghold in San Francisco that he branches out to Oakland and then LA. And over time, he finally got caught in LA. They finally figured out what was going on. His claims weren't fully accurate. And so what happened was they started to kind of expose him, but by that point, it was too late. He had established such a stronghold in LA that he basically primed LA for the Azusa Street revival. He had a huge following there, and it wasn't just the fundamentalists that were at Azusa Street. As you know, there were occultists and there were all kinds of other crazy weirdness. Right. All of those people don't really fit the Pentecostal mold, but they would have fit Dowie's mold because Dowie is doing the spiritualist thing.
Okay. So he was crossing several sort of religious bridges to build his group.
Right.
Okay.
So similar to all cults that I've studied so far, he's quote unquote non-denominational, everybody's welcome, until everybody grows a big following and then everybody else is condemned. Right.
They're the one true prophet,
exactly.
Revelator, whatever the case may be.
Right.
Okay, so he's in California, growing there, and then he ventures from there to where?
He goes actually on tours throughout the United States, and there were several cities that he claimed to be temporarily invading until he was going back to his homeland, which we know didn't happen. But some of the states I've identified were Pennsylvania. He goes through parts of, basically from coast to coast. He's going through all of the towns. He landed, I think it was Evansville, Illinois, is where he called home for a while until he saw an opportunity and seized it during the 1890, I think it was, World's Fair.
Right.
And what happened was he basically set up this sideshow to the entrance of the fair. And as you walk through to gain entrance to the fair, there's this guy saying, "Come on, we'll heal all your diseases, signs, wonders, miracles. Come see the man behind the curtain." And people did, which is, I find it really, really strange.
Well, yeah, and it was kind of a small building, but he had put up a 2-story front to it.
Yeah.
That made it look like this giant tabernacle. It was all just show.
Yep. It was all a facade. It eventually grew. I think there were 2 different healing homes that people would come and stay in and surrender all of their finances to him. So It's quite an operation.
Yeah. Okay, so he goes from there. How did Zion come into play? Because he founded Zion, Illinois.
Zion, I find really interesting. I did not know this also until writing the book. I knew prior to writing it that their cult had just grown so big that they needed a place to stay. But I didn't really understand the logistics of that until I began studying the history building up to it. It wasn't just one Zion, which I also did not know. He started out in that little facade that you mentioned by the World's Fair and began claiming to purchase land to build a Zion years prior. One of the possible locations was in Indiana, and he actually set up communes in Indiana. I think Philadelphia actually got one for a while. So he was growing all these different branches of his sect. And rather than actually he actually tried to purchase land and it fell through. And when it did fall through, he purchased land right down on, I think, Michigan Avenue, downtown Chicago. And he basically occupied an entire city block. And that city block became Zion.
What year would that have been?
I'd have to look it up on the timeline. It was probably 1995, I'm thinking.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're talking after the Chicago fire.
Yeah.
Which was 1871.
So what happened? Right. So what happened was he there were a lot of problems with his type of business. Number one being it wasn't real. There were many people
That's
who
kind
would
of a problem. Yeah.
It's a huge problem, right? There were many people who would come to be healed. And, some did. There are examples of people who came and they recovered of whatever it was that they had. Those are the ones that he boasted. This person came, they're healed, here's a living testimony. What he doesn't do is talk about these are the people who are nightly being taken away by the undertaker under the cover of darkness when nobody can see it. And they silently disappear because they're dead. And there were a number of those instances. And what happened was eventually enough people either did escape with their lives or had family who were deceased who were under this claim that lawsuits started coming by the day. I think one day I counted 30 different lawsuits.
Whoa.
They were just lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. And interestingly, he has enough money coming in from this communal environment that he doesn't even care. He's just paying the suits and sitting there. And one of the accounts, he's sitting there reading the newspaper while they're suing him, just flipping the pages, flippantly doesn't care that he's being sued for somebody who died.
Now, you're saying you use the phrase "some people escaped with their lives." You're making it sound like it was dangerous just to be around this guy.
There were instances of danger. There really were. They were trying to produce a healing, not just simply through prayer. There were, the prayer of the faith, etc. But they actually had a person who was trained in the medical environment to come in and try to administer healing. And they did things like opening up the wounds and it was torturous. There was one instance, one of the biggest lawsuits, they actually tortured a girl unto her death. So there were people who died because of the quote unquote healing.
What was that all about?
It was she, if I remember correctly, she had been severely burned, and they were trying to treat her burns in ways that caused additional pain. That was the most horrific example. There were also examples of people who were mentally ill, had mental health issues, and they were like physically trying to beat the devil out of them. There were people being tortured in this commune. And so those who escaped, I use the word escaped because in my opinion, they literally escaped this thing.
Sounds like that's what it amounted to.
Yeah.
Now, in addition to that, you point out that he was politically involved. So this idea of religious leaders involved in politics is not something new. This goes back a long time.
It really does. I mean, think about it. He had such a following inside of Chicago and the surrounding area that he literally could sway. If somebody was running a close election, he could say, I'll give you 10,000 votes if you do X, Y, and Z for my commune. And he literally had political control of Chicago before the mob came in and took control.
That's interesting. So you can kind of use the Bible if you want to claim virtually anything. And there are organizations actually that kind of help that out. One of them is one of our sponsors, actually. There we go.
Yes. Yeah. And, we all know the awkward feeling, which I hope we get to know it even better when I do this. Okay. Yes. We all know that awkward feeling when someone in a Bible study says, I wish the Bible didn't have all those verses about hell. Or when you're having your couple's devotions and your spouse says, I'm just not comfortable with verses that teach a traditional view of marriage. Or when you're sitting in church and you're thinking, why do all the Bibles I read have to agree with what conservative pastors are teaching? Well, that's why we're introducing the My Bible. It's guaranteed to be the most comfortable Bible you'll ever own. We've spent literally minutes creating a way you can have the Bible that's perfect for you. You used to have to go down some dark alley to find a Bible like this, but not anymore. Just write down all the places where you want to make your Bible more comfortable for you, and then email them to us or enter them into our handy online form, and the results speak for themselves. Yolanda from Portland says, now that I have my Bible, I never worry that my white male pastor's sermons might actually be right. Ben from seminary says, my Bible gave me the confidence I need to drop out of my Hebrew and Greek classes. And Renee from Madison says, every single one of my anti-capitalist, anti-police, anti-social protest chants comes from my Bible. So when someone throws an uncomfortable verse at you, you can say, that's not in my Bible. Find it at mybible.cult. And you need to find one too, John, just for you.
Just for you. Yeah. So I am not really very far from Zion, Illinois. And a good friend, Rob Brooks, was born and grew up in Zion, Illinois. So he has a particular interest in it.
I can show you guys a map of it if you want. If our viewers want to see, just give me a second here.
And even if they don't want to,
and even if they, I'm going to just do it. It's like, it's north of Chicago, near the Wisconsin border. Zion, Illinois, and you would be like over here someplace, right, Don? Where I'm my cursor.
Roughly, I'm almost directly west of Zion, Illinois.
Oh, so really close to the border. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's Zion.
I'm 12 miles from Wisconsin, so I really am quite borderline, as you know.
Really are, and you're almost a cheesehead. And this was a brochure. It says, notice how it says over here, a resume, kind of like was a sales brochure,
Mm-hmm.
And they give the plat. It's plat number 1 of the city of Zion. There's a subdivision. It had a temple site located in the middle. You can see they had the neighborhoods all planned out. There's the temple site. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can find online. It's amazing what there is just by Googling John Alexander Dowie.
Yeah.
Images. They were making fun of him in political cartoons across the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
All kinds of things.
You mentioned it looked like a sales brochure. It actually was a sales brochure. He was selling the plots.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is he controlled, right. if you join this communal environment, you also forfeited control of the money. He had his own banking system. So not only was he selling these plots, he was also taking your money as he sold them.
He also ran other businesses that you could be employed by his organization.
Basically, you put your entire all your finances into escrow just to move in there.
Yeah,
his escrow. So
I think he had the first Nottingham lace company in the United States, factory, and imported. To be Nottingham lace, it has to be actually produced by the people from Nottingham. So he imported the lace makers into the United States to start his factories.
Just hire the sheriff of Nottingham and you'll be okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So he really was quite successful. He was worth multi-millions of dollars in his day.
In today's money, it's $500 million.
Whoa. That's a lot of money.
Wow, that is a lot of money.
Yep.
So
he was labeled the richest man in the West. So you can see why every single scoundrel out there wants to recreate what he did. And in the United States, the way the Constitution's written, the freedom, the separation of church and state, there's almost no risk. So this is a scam that you can't be tried for in the United States. So all of these crooks and criminals wanting to do this now have a prototype of somebody who successfully did it. And here's the roadmap to what he did.
So we still have that even going on today, same kind of a thing. We have hucksters and con men raising large amounts of money, claiming to be performing miraculous healings on a regular basis, and virtually no accountability.
Right. All right.
Okay. So that they're kind of following the path of Dowie and doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
They're patterning after Dowie, and like you said, he was a heavy influencer of Pentecostalism. Charles Fox Parham went to the commune to see how it worked before he created his own commune. And I just learned this through writing this book, and shortly after I found some more information. Charles Fox Parham and his wife, I can't remember her name, they moved into Zion for a period of time, and he was one of the people in line to succeed Dowie. His wife ran one of the healing homes.
Okay. So there's a lot of connections that take you all the way back to Dowie.
Right.
What about John G. Lake? Now, that's a name that many in Pentecostalism will know, but few outside of Pentecostalism might.
I have had multiple people beg me to start my book on Lake. Lake was from the Dowie commune. His whole backstory is complete fiction, according to the documents that have been shared with me to this point. I've not started my research yet, but there is so much information. He is definitely the same type of scoundrel, and he is the reason that Dowieism, Branhamism, and all of these other Pentecostalism subsects and splinter groups invaded Africa.
Right.
Yeah. Now the thing is, Dowie's life did not end well, did it? And he didn't. He died at 59. So he and basically everything just disintegrated into dust. All of his plans and everything. It just. Can you address that?
Yeah, what's interesting is this also falls into the prototype of Branhamism. Towards the end of his life, Dowie learned that he could record sermons and play them into the churches and not have to be present. So you could record a whole month of sermons and go take a sabbatical. And he owned lake property and various properties to go take his sabbaticals. The church that my family escaped, my grandfather was the head of Branham's home church. They did the same exact thing. Sunday meeting was going and sitting in a pew and listening to a tape recording of Branham.
Wow.
Well, a record, actually. It would have been a record at the time.
LP.
Well, they were reel-to-reel recordings. Before that was a wire recording, and then they did reel-to-reel, and then those transitioned to tape decks. Now they have MP3s, etc.
Okay.
But we would go sit in the pews. And I remember this one event. It's a funny side story worth telling. I got to see things that nobody else saw because of my family status, right?
Huh.
So they also had a shortwave radio in the church. So if your children were unruly, you could go sit in your car with your children and turn your radio on and listen to the same recording. Well, I didn't take much advantage of that, but there was one day that my child was very, very rambunctious. I took him out. I saw my aunt drive behind the church with a big dent in her fender, and she goes and knocks on the back door, and a deacon comes out and looks at it. He goes back in. He grabs the other deacons. They're all standing looking at her car. They go back in, grab my grandfather and the assistant pastor. So at this point, there is not a single elder in the church. They're all sitting there looking at this dent in the car, while nobody else in the church realizes, because they're all listening to this tape recording. That's this.
They healed the dent. I'm waiting in suspense here. Did they lay hands on it?
They may have. I don't know. That kind of thing actually happens in this cult. People will pray that the physical objects be healed, and it's really, really weird.
I didn't think it was going to be too far afield. So.
Yeah. But this came from Dowie. So towards the end of his life, he did take a lot of vacations. There is some question planted by the research. Evidence suggests two things. Number one, he did have a stroke, and they tried to keep it, like all cults, they tried to keep it from the members. And he was unable to heal himself of the stroke. And then he takes a sabbatical. The question comes as to whether or not he did recover, whether or not he was intending to come back at all. There is actually this question. But towards the end of his life, he and a Muslim prophet got in this fight to the death, or prayer to the death, if you want to call it. The Muslim prophet was saying, you're a fake and a fraud, so let's have a prayer duel to the death.
And did he lose?
He lost.
He lost to the Muslim.
What's interesting,
the guy who kind of took over Zion after that was Frank Volova, and he was not Pentecostal.
No, he was not. And there was this weird point in time in which Volova and Parham were at odds, fighting each other. I just now, within the last month, came to this realization. I'm working with a Pentecostal historian. There's also evidence out there, I'm sure you've seen it, where Charles Fox Parham was accused of sodomy in Texas.
No, I haven't seen that. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah, so this is a thing. If you go research it, you'll find this is actually a thing. But it turns out it really appears that Volova or somebody maliciously planted some information, because Parham did not get convicted. He was tried, but in the United States, you're innocent until proven guilty. Well, he was found to be innocent. Something did happen, and who knows what it was. What's interesting is the man that he was with was a black man, and they're deep in the heart of racist territory. And so just being in the same hotel room with a black man could have also been construed as something illegitimate.
Untoward, right? Yeah.
Right. So I don't think that this actually happened. However, I do see evidence that he was trying to take over Zion. He actually went there and tried. And Volivo actually won out, obviously, because Parham went to Tulsa and started his Bethel commune.
Now, I did find, as you saw, I found basically a prospectus with diagrams and all that, a mapping out of what they were planning to build. How developed did Zion actually get? I haven't really I know it's a full-blown city today, but it was called Zion City. That was the name it had under Dowie. How much did he realize of his dream, as it were?
Towards the end of his life, I think he saw a good bit of it. I don't know if it was fully developed. another interesting story. They ran out of money while they were building it,
Right.
and there were huge problems. He tried to invade New York City, and he took a commune crowd of like 5,000 people, and they were going to go door to door to every house in New York City. And New York was like, "Get out of here! We're not taking this stuff." And so what happened was this was a huge expense. It was millions of dollars to fund this thing. They went bankrupt, and so for a period of time, they tried to do outreach and to bring more donations in to fund the building of Zion. And they went into this one town that I actually go through frequently in Ohio. Can't remember the name. It was Mansfield or somewhere. We go through it on vacation sometimes. But the Dowieites went in groups of 2, like they do with the Jehovah's Witness cult, and tried to, prophesize and spread the religion of Dowie. Well, they took them out into the road and they painted them with a paintbrush, painted them blue, and then tarred and feathered them. And they kept coming back. And so this turned into a huge problem. They were actually going to kill these Zionites. So Dowie convinced, through his political pool, the governor of Ohio to intervene with the military. And then they were seen as martyrs. Once this happened, people started funding it, and it grew again. And I think a good bit of Zion was built out. I don't know if it was completely built, but a lot of it was.
Yeah. And the kind of the way that city was laid out, all roads led to the tabernacle.
Right.
And it's still there. I mean, I think they recently, in the last few years, maybe have renamed it. Was the Christian Catholic Church? Yeah, I think that's what it was.
Christian Catholic Church.
Yeah. And I spoke there once, oddly enough, not maybe 20 years ago, and got a little bit of the history from the youth director at the time. And one of the things he pointed out is there's still Dowieite followers in Africa. And the only missionaries that they will talk to are those that come from that church. They won't talk to any other missionaries. So
and we should pause for anybody who got hung up on the word Catholic. The word Catholic in this instance is not the Roman Catholic Church. Right. The Roman Catholic Church, the word Catholic is not the name of the denomination. It just means the church. It's the group of people, the body, etc.
Well, one thing that I was surprised at is just how amazingly influential Dowie was in his own lifetime. He was a household word. I don't know how literally to take that. It's kind of like I'll mention some people who I think their names are like household words, and people will look at me with a blank stare. But he had this huge reach, this huge presence. I'm sure geographically, if you were based on what I've read, he was in the newspapers all the time in Chicago during
coast to coast. We're talking 50,000 newspaper articles exist on Dowie. Yeah. And that is concentrated after he moved to Chicago. So we're talking in the span of, 10, probably 7 years was the concentration. 7 years produced 50,000 newspaper articles.
So, he was a celebrity, and maybe the biggest religious celebrity of his time, of his day.
Yeah, definitely.
And so now it's like not only did his dream of a commune and all these things connected with it kind of dissolve into the dust, but his name. I mean, if it weren't for people like you and others who research and write about him, and Don, you've known about him for a while, and you've been telling me about him for years. If it weren't for people like you guys, who would ever think about the guy anymore?
Well, the problem is there are so many people that idolize him, that promote him and leave out all of the bad stuff. So you would not know that this guy was a con man. God's Generals is basically the foundation for groups that are claiming that Dowie was the spiritual beginnings of the new Apostolic Reformation. And God's generals does no critical examination of these men whatsoever, and basically produce these videos and books, etc., based off of what their claims are, but not what actually happened.
I did use one video, which is the narrator was clearly somewhat sympathetic to Dowie. He just thought Dowie was a guy with basically good ideas who just kind of made some bad decisions toward the end of his life. He couldn't deny some of the really, maybe you can address some of the things that really became scandalous, but he gave a lot of helpful information in terms of chronology and events and things like that. But, based on what else is out there, I said, this guy's basically whitewashing. So today, there, unlike the turn of the last century when he was a very well-known celebrity, he's no longer that, but he has a devoted following today. Mm-hmm. And they know what he did, and they know some of the things you mentioned. I'm sure they know maybe most of the things you mentioned with regard to failed healings and deaths and lawsuits and things like that, but they choose to overlook them, or they choose to minimize them and downplay them, because he stands in a line of succession. He stands as kind of like almost like an Apostle Paul to this movement. And so that's not an exaggeration, is it, to kind of give him that kind of a status in what comes later, what has now become the New Apostolic Reformation? There's been other things along the way.
Yeah, the real problem, it really comes down to a question, because myself, having come out of a movement that this was truly the prototype, there were things that William Branham did that we knew weren't quite right, and you just overlook them and you keep going on. The premise behind that type of thought is this movement was of God. So because this movement is God, I can forgive this man. He was human, and God is in this thing, right? This movement, this cult, etc. The problem is, I'm just as guilty as the people in Zion. When I was raised in this thing, I was raised to believe this. I had no idea that there could be even a question. It wasn't until I started digging and started understanding that these things that Branham did, these things that Dowie did, if this was a movement by God, these men wouldn't be doing these things.
Right.
Dowie built his empire by stealing money. He would ask people. I've got actually copies of some of the requests, but he'll ask people for money to borrow for Zion, and I'll pay you back with such and such interest, and never paid them back. And that was part of the lawsuits he had. So he's stealing all of this money from people while preying upon those who are desperately in need of actual medical attention, several of which identified would have lived had they actually went to a hospital. Some of one of the most painful examples, this child had a broken bone. I mean, literally all they had to do was set the bone, and went to Dowie instead of the doctor because he's telling people don't go to the doctors. And the child fortunately was taken away, but not after suffering heavily for his broken bone.
And this was, Dowie was not alone. The reason I even covered him in my cult series on Wednesday night is because of his connection to a guy named Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, who is the kind of, he sired, you might say, a whole slew of these mind over matter type cults, including Christian Science. Mary Baker Eddy departs from Christian Science and Quimby, in that Quimby would say disease and pain and all that, that's an illusion, but he still acknowledged the existence of matter, the material realm. What's her name? Mary Baker Eddy takes it one step further and denies the existence of matter itself.
Right. She goes full Hinduism on
you.
She goes
basically. Full, well, it doesn't even, does Hinduism deny the existence of matter, really?
Yeah, all is illusion, all is Maya, all is illusion. Yeah.
So, so we're all in the Matrix then. So, it's pretty much what what Christian Science teaches, whereas all these other groups like Unity, the Unity School of Christianity, they don't go quite that far, but they still deny the existence of pain and suffering. And therefore, one of the things they have all in common is a militant opposition to the medical establishment. They're against doctors. And so here's Dowie doing his own thing, but still he is anti-doctor. And I wasn't really aware of just how much pain and suffering this caused, not only in Dowie's following, but in Christian Science and in other groups. And I'm talking about genuine pain and suffering. People, dying in many cases. There have been lawsuits against Christian Science families over the years for not taking their and practitioners for not using the proper medical means. So this was a really big deal in many respects.
Yeah. The premise for this type of religion is the ending of the book of Mark. And it's the ending, the verses that have the statements that the snake handling churches frequently quote.
Right.
And what happens when you're in this type of group is when healing doesn't come, or if you become stagnant in your religion, there's this, because it's a religion where the faith, the effect of the faith is on the shoulders of the individual. It's not how much God is faithful. It's how much do you believe God and you can heal yourself. The problem with this premise is that it produces the snake handling churches, the poison drinking churches, because they try to take it a step further. They try to prove their faith to God, not just prove their faith to man, but they try to prove their faith to God. I came across, while doing this research, there were not medicinal companies, there were evil companies who were producing strychnine for religious purposes. They're actually producing a liquid to poison the people.
Homeopathic remedies were really big. You didn't have the kind of doctors that you have today.
Strychnine, they knew what strychnine did, though, right?
Yeah, it's poison. I mean, yeah, there were different flavors of poison that they were giving, like actual poison that would kill you. They were selling it to churches, and this went all the way up and all the way to the Supreme Court, I believe, to try to stop this thing. But again, separation of church and state creates this weird conundrum. What do you do with this? The people are willingly poisoning themselves.
Well, they would give, for example, they would give mercury for sexually transmitted diseases.
Yeah.
Very deadly stuff. So, yeah. And that goes on today. So we're still following the same track of, I have declared you healed. You have to now own the healing. It's your responsibility to have sufficient faith to be healed. And just two really quick stories. One is, I think I shared this previously, chaplain at a small hospital near where I lived. I lived in Lombard, in Glendale Heights. And they brought this young man in, he was early 50s maybe, and he had died in transit. He had cancer. It was curable cancer, 90-some% survival rate. But he was told at a Kenneth Copeland healing event that by getting treatment, he was claiming the cancer. He was claiming the illness. What he needed to do was to claim the healing, which meant stop getting treatment, stop taking the medications, claim the healing, and then God will heal you. He stopped claiming the sickness, started claiming the healing. The result was, within a very short amount of time, he passed away. Yeah. His wife, then, as I met her at the door to try to lend some comfort, looked at me and said, "Your God lied to me." So now we have the situation. It isn't that it was he listened to a false teacher. It was that God lied.
Yeah,
that's tragic. And another was one of the television news stations, I forget which one now, did a documentary on Benny Hinn, and they were following a particular young boy who was sick, who was terminal illness. His father was taking him to every Benny Hinn event he could get him to, and they could never somehow get him up on stage. He was in a wheelchair. finally, the producers shamed him into bringing him up, and he was declared healed. About 3 or 4 months later, the young man died. And so they interviewed the father again to say, do you realize that this was false? He goes, oh, no, Benny Hinn is a true healer. It's my fault. I did something evil, and God is punishing me for that.
Yeah.
So it is never the fault of the con man, whether it's John Dowie, William Branham, Benny Hinn. It's always the fault of the individuals who are going to get healing or bring a family member to be healed.
Yeah. And in some churches, it's just the teaching without necessarily the charismatic leader. I had a friend whose sister had a very close friend in the church who came down with cancer in one of these Word Faith churches. And, in the beginning, I mean, this woman and her friend were surrounded by a loving church, and they all claimed the healing, as you'd say. They would name it and claim it, and they were so convinced. Well, gradually, she started coming down with all these symptoms, and this woman, her friend, would tend to her needs, and she'd still get people coming over to the house and trying to encourage and pray, lay hands on her, keep it going. But the worse she got, the fewer the friends came over. And then it became clear that she was nearing death. Not only was the dying woman being shunned, she was being shunned by the church, but so also was my friend's sister, who was taking care of her. And it got to the point where once this woman died, my friend, no one would talk. No one from that church would talk to my friend's sister. She was an outcast now because she was being blamed. She contributed to this lack of faith because by taking care of her or something, I don't know, she let the woman believe, they claimed the sickness.
That's sad.
And for years, that woman, my friend's sister, was devastated for years. I don't know if she's gotten over it yet.
Yeah. A couple of stories. So go ahead.
I want to make sure that we show this. Behind me is a cover of the book.
Yes.
It's Militant Christian Extremism, an examination of John Alexander Dowie. We have the link below, so you can order a copy, and I would really recommend getting that, if for no other reason, just to kind of understand where some, at least, of the modern day Pentecostal movement came from, because we can move it back and go, okay, John Dowie impacted and affected F.F. Bosworth, John G. Lake, and others, who then went out and basically created a lot of what is happening in the, as Ron pointed out, the New Apostolic Reformation of today.
Right.
And how does he connect to Azusa Street Revival, John?
So he primed Azusa Street. He was there creating and establishing this movement of people who believed this way. So there were a large group of people who were Dowieites and others who were influenced by Dowie. And F.F. Bosworth, who was, working with Branham and was Dowie's, I think he was the band director. He was an elder in Dowie's commune. He was at Azusa Street whenever it happened. So there were Dowieites and Dowie leaders in Azusa Street.
Wow. So there's a definite connection.
Right.
Absolutely.
Definite connection.
Yep.
And many don't realize that. So they view this as a supernatural event that God orchestrated on, nobody was expecting it. They weren't looking for anything. They were just sort of having a prayer meeting, and all of a sudden the Spirit fell on them. That doesn't really play out when you look at all of the actual players involved at the time.
Bosworth went on to be one of the founding members of the Assemblies of God, and that sect, through William Branham and actually during the Jim Jones timeline, splintered into several other groups. So Pentecostalism kind of grew, split, and created all of these splinter groups. But they all joined back to, not all of them with Dowie as the head, but all of them with Dowie as a big influence.
Right. So, Well, I'm glad you joined us again, John.
Thank
It's
you.
always fascinating because you have these sort of what most people would think of as obscure groups, but that have had a profound impact on North American Christianity for sure. And
Absolutely.
also other parts of the world, Africa, for example. Dowie's had a big impact over there. So, Ron, would you walk us out of here?
I will try to do it my best here. Let's give credit to where credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just in Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and The Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polly Gummas. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Your Leg Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murphy Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Grievance Resolution Director is Giovanna Pisami. Director of Privacy Assurance is Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc., in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, though you will never be able to prove that in a court of law. Never. No.
Never do it.
Hasn't happened yet.
It hasn't happened yet. All right. And with that, again, get his book. It's at the bottom in the description panel. And we can now do our royal wave.